Resident Evil 4's frantic village battle is in my mind the best opening encounter not just in a Resident Evil title, but in any video game full stop. Its combination of what was at the time a brand new perspective for the series, enemies more dynamic than those in any previous Resident Evil entry, and the wealth of gameplay options on offer made it something far ahead of its time. And in this video, I'm going to talk about why I think it's such an extraordinary achievement. But before we get to the encounter itself, it's important we quickly look at what takes place prior to everything getting out of hand. Star of Resident Evil 2 and US government agent Leon S. Kennedy travels to rural Spain in search of the president's kidnapped daughter Ashley Graham, who is reportedly being held by an unidentified group of people.
According to our intelligence, there's reliable information about a sighting of a girl that looks very similar to the president's daughter. Apparently, she's being withheld by some unidentified group of people. Who would have thought that my first job would have been a rescue mission?
Arriving a short walk away from the village he plans to investigate, Leon leaves the Spanish police officers sent to assist him minding the car while he takes off on foot, which is where players take control. The first thing I'd imagine 99% of those players did was head into the nearby house to take on the first of many villagers they'd meet during Resident Evil 4. On the surface, this encounter and those which follow during this introductory section are fairly standard affairs, designed to gently ease you into combat before the game begins proper. Indeed, you'll find similar in most third or even first-person action games to this very day. However, these brief moments at the beginning of the game spent getting to grips with things were especially important back in 2005 when Resident Evil 4 released, because it was the first mainline title in the series to move away from fixed camera angles and towards something a little more modern. Instead of occupying a static position as it had in prior Resident Evil games, the camera in 4 sat relatively close to Leon's right shoulder and followed him at all times, moving further forwards when a weapon was drawn so that its focus was always on the action rather than on Leon himself. Resident Evil 4 was by no means the first game to feature an over-the-shoulder perspective when aiming. Splinter Cell, for example, had already used it to great effect across multiple titles, but the way 4 used it during normal movement and aiming felt like something new and exciting, and first to use it or not, there can be no arguing that Resident Evil 4 was without doubt the title responsible for popularising it. As mentioned, because everything felt so new back in 2005, these opening moments were vital in helping you acclimatise to the game's new mechanics. The first villager was placed slap bang in front of you to give you an easy first encounter using the new aiming system, and a few more relatively easy encounters followed to give you time to practice further. You could use objects in the environment such as windows to your advantage, and there were plenty of crates containing items dotted around which could be smashed using the new dedicated knife button. Everything I've just listed would come in handy during the big opening encounter in the village just moments later, and so it was definitely a wise decision on Capcom's part to include this short section first, so that they could ensure you were familiar with most if not all of the tools needed to survive the assault which followed. After checking in with Hunnigan and finding out what happened to at least one of the police officers you were with, it was time for the best opening encounter in gaming to begin. In my view, there are three things which made this encounter so brilliant: the over-the-shoulder perspective, the dynamic enemies, and the design of the arena itself and the gameplay options it afforded you. The new perspective is perhaps the one least tied to this encounter in particular, but it nonetheless had a very important part to play. What blew my mind when I first took on this set piece was the incredible amount of freedom this new over-the-shoulder camera offered. In Resident Evil titles using fixed camera angles, the only options most of the time were aiming directly at an enemy and firing, waiting until they approached before going for a headshot, or shooting downwards at monsters closer to the floor. But Resident Evil 4 changed everything. For the first time, it was up to you to choose how a scene was framed instead of it being left up to Capcom. All you had to do was move Leon to the right place, face your preferred direction, and hold down the aim button. And once you had the aim button held down and numerous villagers were in your sights, there were even more options to choose from. You could go for the head for an easy kill, or for crowd control shoot them in the legs to bring them down to their knees and then follow up with a powerful kick. If an enemy was brandishing a weapon, you could also shoot it out of their hands, or even blast projectiles out of mid-air. And of course, it didn't matter whether you were being attacked from ground level, inside a house, on a roof, or at the top of a tower. Thanks to the new camera, you were always able to defend yourself nonetheless. If Resident Evil 4 had continued using zombies as its primary enemy, then I'd guess combining Leon's newfound versatility with such an open area would have made the game a somewhat easy experience, but thankfully 4 also introduced a brand new threat in the form of Ganados, and they are the second reason why this encounter works as well as it does. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that the Ganados are used to their fullest potential right here at the start of the game. Ganados were nothing like the slow, lumbering zombies of old. They could duck and dodge, making it difficult for you to hit them. They could run as well as walk, they could wield weapons, and perhaps most importantly, they could seemingly react to your actions. If you barricaded yourself inside a house, they would do their best to break in. They could use ladders, and if you kicked one down to slow their pursuit, they would eventually put it back up. If you climbed the tower at one end of the area, they threw Molotov cocktails to flush you out. And throughout all of this, it really truly felt like they were thinking for themselves. As you battled to survive this relentless new threat, all of the power Capcom had placed in your hands thanks to the new camera system suddenly began to quickly disappear, replaced with the feeling that there was in fact no escaping the situation you'd managed to find yourself in. Fortunately, however, if you were paying attention when playing the brief introductory section prior to this encounter, you may have suspected that there were some ways to turn the tide in your favour. The most obvious and by far the least exciting example of this was the item boxes scattered across the area. You will have already seen plenty of them during your journey to the village, and finding and breaking them was the best way of keeping your limited supplies topped up. What was far more interesting was the ability to use objects in the environment to give yourself the upper hand. Windows could be climbed through to create new escape routes, doors and windows could be barricaded using furniture, and as mentioned earlier, you could kick down ladders to stop your attackers in their tracks. The map itself was also smartly designed in that there were 3 lanes which gave you plenty of room to manoeuvre. In the middle was a much wider path you could use to create a bit of space between yourself and the huge number of enemies, along with left and right lanes which included various buildings you could use as cover, and they all also looped back in on each other, so there was usually always a way of escaping if things happened to become a little too crowded. There was also much more verticality than that found in any previous Resident Evil title to take advantage of as well, and between that and the 3-lane setup, there were more than enough options for safely moving around the map if you planned your route in advance. That being said, there were a couple of dead ends which it was possible to get caught in, but they are about the only thing I can criticise when it comes to looking at how this area was laid out. And of course, I can't talk about this amazing encounter without mentioning perhaps my favourite part of the entire experience. If you enter the larger house on the right hand side of the map, this cutscene will occur.
No dejes que se escape.
Vayan por detrás. Who are these people?
Bloqueale el paso.
What are they planning? Chainsaw. Son of a...
At this point, you may have thought you were in big trouble, but heading upstairs to find a shotgun, you might have begun to feel a little better about things. That is until you realise the cutscene also triggered the appearance of a terrifying new enemy wielding a chainsaw, an enemy who could kill you in one hit. It is a brilliant first example of how Capcom was able to toy with your expectations throughout Resident Evil 4's 15 or so hour runtime, and I'd argue that this new swagger to the way encounters were designed was no better demonstrated than by the appearance of Dr. Salvador. And after enough time had passed and enough Ganados had been dispatched, this scene would trigger to end the encounter, driving home the idea that you really only managed to survive thanks to sheer luck. Much of what I've mentioned so far you've probably encountered in other games, and this is why looking at the encounter in context is so incredibly important. Nowadays games may feature one or all of the 3 things I've highlighted during this video, but back in 2005 it was rare that a title would feature one of them, let alone all 3. What makes Resident Evil 4's opening encounter so extraordinary is that Capcom managed to take this trio of fantastic concepts and combine them into something that was quite unlike anything that had ever been seen before. Each of them could have been introduced alone to a new Resident Evil title, and that probably would have been enough to reinvigorate the series. But Capcom didn't want to create a Resident Evil game that used just one of these amazing new ideas, and they instead decided to use all 3. And nowhere do they come together more beautifully than during Resident Evil 4's opening encounter. It blew everyone away when the game released, and it still holds up extremely well to this very day, in a way I don't think any other opening encounter I've played does. It was the proof of concept for an entirely new style of third-person action game, which titles like Dead Space and Gears of War would later use as inspiration, and in my view, it played a huge part in making Resident Evil 4 one of the most influential video games created during the modern era. Other games may have taken 4's formula and continued to build on it, but the fact that its opening encounter showcased so many new ideas in one cohesive package before any other is why I consider it to be the best opening encounter ever created. Thanks for taking the time to watch the video, boys, girls and government agents. If you enjoyed it, do consider liking, subscribing and letting me know your thoughts, and hopefully I'll catch you all again soon.